So I'm going to start with a confession. I've been asked to talk to you about childhood in Dublin in the 20th century, but the truth is many of you have more first-hand experience of this than I do. You see, I spent my childhood on the Canadian prairies. I grew up in Winnipeg, which is slap dab in the middle of North America. It's kind of a swinging metropolis in the middle of a wheat field. So I grew up there in the 70s and the 80s. But just in case you're worried I know nothing about childhood in Dublin, I moved here 19 years ago, and the reason I moved here was because I married a fella who grew up in Ranelagh, and he was the youngest of 6. His father died when he was about 2 or 3 months old, and his mum had the challenge of trying to raise these 7 children herself. So I think the most important thing to remember is that there's never been one experience of childhood, whether it's Dublin in the 20th century or in any century. And today, the childhood of a girl who's growing up in a 3-bedroom semi-D out in the suburbs is going to have a very different childhood than the boy who is growing up with his homeless family in a hotel room, even though they're both residing in Dublin. And I've got a couple of pictures here, or a few, actually 4 pictures that illustrate this. So this is what I mean. We go into the past. We've got a little girl here. She's all dressed up with the doll for the studio portrait. One gets the sense that she comes from a fairly comfortable background. So she's having her portrait taken. And here we have a child that's having its picture taken as well. But that's because this is evidence in a neglect case. So you can imagine these 2 children, very, very different experiences, though they're growing up in a similar time period. Or alternatively, I've got a picture of, this is the Dublin Family that I've been hearing so much about over the last 20 years, the McGraths. And, that experience of growing up in a family is very different than if you're growing up in an institution. And this young fella here is quite a famous young fella. That's Paddy Doyle, and you may remember his groundbreaking book, The God Squad. And Paddy was fostered by my husband's family. The nuns had decided that maybe for doing his leaving cert, he'd be better off living with a family. So Paddy's life and his growing up, as documented in The God Squad, would be very different from the hijinks and the stories I've heard about the McGraths of Ranelagh. So I think that's really important, that we need to remember that factors like gender, social class, religious or political affiliation, what part of Dublin you live in, all of these things will impact on the childhood that you might have, the experiences that you have. And these factors are going to be evident in the examples of representative Dublin childhoods that I'm going to discuss. So these childhoods that I want to talk about tonight fall into 3 main categories. Childhood in a time of war and revolution, which is the subject of my own current research, and then childhoods of the poor, and then childhoods of those growing up in the suburban middle-class milieu. So turn of the 20th century. Now, in the early 20th century, the lives of children in Dublin were influenced by new legislation and social policies, the increasing authority of science, and, of course, war and revolution. So by the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there was a growing perception in the Western world of children as a national resource, but also a group within society that needed legal protection. In those years leading up to the First World War, they were characterized by a pervasive anxiety about the future. So older European powers were fearing that they would be overtaken by new rivals that were coming forward. So Western countries were increasingly concerned about industrialization and urbanization because they feared that these things had led to or contributed to a degradation of the physical and the moral condition of their populations. And one response to this anxiety was to take action to improve the health, the education, the welfare, the morality of the rising generation. So you couldn't do much about the adults. They were a bit of a lost cause. But if you focused on the kids, that was your future. That was really important. So attempts were made to mould children's minds and bodies as a future resource for the state. And this can be seen in a variety of initiatives at the time. So there were campaigns to improve children's health, the introduction of compulsory schooling, the addition of physical exercise like PE to the education curriculum, and increasing concern about the nature of children's literature and pastimes, and that certainly hasn't changed. We still worry about those things. So an example of the early 20th century's focus on legislative reform can be seen in the Children's Act of 1908, and that was implemented in both Britain and Ireland. So basically what it did was for the last, the previous about three quarters of a century, there had been in Britain and Ireland various bits of legislation that was put in place to try to improve children's lives. So trying to legislate for making sure that if children were working, that they shouldn't be working full-time, or that there should be limits to what age group or how many hours that they worked. So trying to prohibit most full-time child labour, or detaining young offenders, and these could include vagrants or homeless children, and putting them in reformatories or industrial schools. And I know we have a horror of that now, but at the time this was seen as thought that this would actually be better for them, that they would have a real childhood. Also delineating conditions under which children could be taken from their parents or guardians. And also, of course, there was legislation to prevent cruelty to children in the 1880s and 1890s. So you'd had all these bits and pieces of legislation throughout the 19th century that were being put in place. And again, in 1892, you had the implementation of compulsory primary school education as well. So basically, what the Children's Act of 1908 was doing was bringing together all these bits of legislation, pulling them together into one bundle, and also pioneering new policies, like creating special courts to deal with child offenders. So, and I think it's important to remember that this 1908 Act remained the main legislative instrument that dealt with child protection in the Republic of Ireland up until the 1991 Childcare Act. So this legislation at the beginning of the 20th century, even after independence, had influence on children's lives all the way up to near the end of the 20th century. And also the late 19th and early 20th century were a time when we had the kind of the height of the belief that science was the key to a better childhood and that it could improve life chances for children. So science could tell mothers how best to raise their children. And so you had the promotion of scientific findings regarding best practice in relation to feeding and the nutrition of children, personal hygiene, sanitation, physical exercise and medicine, and all these kind of scientific evidence that was put forward and policies put in place helped to lower infant mortality rates and improve children's health in general, both here in Dublin and in elsewhere. And there's another thing that was going on in this same time period. This was when we see the rise of uniformed youth groups. And these groups were part of the cult of discipline, training, and manliness. All of that was kind of part of this growing anxiety about the First World War. So you wanted to get your men and your youth to be all trained up. This sense that, your manhood, living in these urban cities and overcrowded areas, people were becoming, they weren't as well nourished and they were quite decadent, on street corners smoking cigarettes and stuff, that this wasn't, you needed to build up your population. So the adult founders of uniformed youth groups, what they were trying to do was to put forward and to promote the values of order and physical fitness and service to your country. And the whole idea was that these were values that would serve the state in time of war. So we think of this as the period of the Boys Brigade and the Boy Scouts and the Girl Guides. And they're examples of British youth groups that very quickly spread here to Ireland during that period. Now, Irish nationalists weren't too sure about these groups. They felt they were too imperialist. And so what they were concerned about was that they didn't want their boys, their nationalist, good Irish boys, to be going along and joining these youth groups. But they could see the benefit and the fun to be had to join one of these youth groups. So what they did was they set up Irish nationalist alternatives because they saw young people as the future of the Irish nationalist movement. So, of course, the most famous one was Na Fianna Éireann, started by Countess Markievicz and Bulmer Hobson in 1909. A lesser-known one, now it was, I should also mention, it was mainly for boys. We've got a few girls in Belfast. You had some rebel girls in Belfast who decided they'd set up their own troop. But here in Dublin, there was the Clan Miguel Girl Scouts, started around 1910, 1911, very similar to the Fianna, but for girls. So these groups, they were basically what they were doing was training young people for their future role in the Irish Revolution. But often clashes would break out between these different youth groups in Dublin, and they kind of mirrored the clashes in politics between adults. So just a few stories that I ran across was there was a raid on a Boy Scout camp in Crumlin, and during this raid the Fianna captured flags and military equipment, and they ordered these, because it was English Scouts, there was a big Boy Scout camp in Crumlin. They'd all a bit of a jamboree, I suppose you'd say. And so the Fianna guys were going down, and there was English Scouts there, and they were ordering them back to Liverpool, get out of here, back home, we don't want you here. And then there's another story that I ran across, a wonderful story about youthful hijinks. Con Colbert's sister, when she was later giving her witness statement to the Bureau of Military History, her name was Elizabeth, and she recalled that he got himself into a bit of a tussle up in the Dublin mountains with some British Boy Scouts. Now, I don't know whether they were actually Boy Scouts who'd come over for Britain, or they were Irish Boy Scouts, but in the Baden-Powell Scouts. She doesn't make that clear. But apparently the Fianna took the Union Jack from these Boy Scouts, seized it from them, even though these Boy Scouts apparently were much bigger fellas, and the Fianna were littler guys, but they were wiry, and they got the Union Jack. So you can imagine and I've run across other stories. This was, taunting the police, all sorts of youthful hijinks that was going on with these youth groups of the time. Also, too, reading material. This was something that nationalists worried about, was what Irish children were reading. And I think we need to remember that in the early 20th century, reading was much more popular. Today how we're always trying to get kids to read. Not so much of the TV watching and the video games and all the rest of it. We're trying to read, get them reading books. That wasn't such an issue in the early 20th century, because that was a really popular pastime. And getting reading material was cheaper than, say, going to the cinema or something like that. So Irish nationalists, they were encouraging Irish kids to read Irish alternatives to very popular British story papers of the time. And I've got an example here. This is from The Boy's Friend. And one of the few, I was going through a lot of these papers, and there was very little Irish content in them. If there was, often they were stories about, you'd have an Irish lad and a Scots fella and a Welsh guy, and they're off, or actually rarely a Welsh person, actually, often an English fella, Cockney, and they would all go off to somewhere in the British Empire. Maybe they were off to Australia or Canada, and there they were, all these plucky young Brits over in the Empire, but very little about Ireland. This is a rare example. This was these story papers. They come out weekly. They cost about a penny, so very affordable. We were on newsprint, quite cheap paper, and they had stories. They'd be like school stories or mysteries or thrillers. This one started to be published in June of 1914. It was called The Legions of the Kaiser. And it's set in Ireland. You've got, Ireland supposedly is on the brink of, you've got the Ulster Volunteers, and then you've got the nationalists, who are kind of sort of referred to as almost as if they're kind of corner boys. And you've got a young Irish hero. He's from a Gaelic Irish background, but he's all on board for home rule, and he loves an election because there's lots of ructions and it's good crack. And so basically what you've got is, in the middle of the night, the Germans invade Ireland. And what happens? The nationalists and the unionists come together and they repel the Germans and they get them out of Ireland. And the last line in the story is, you've got one of the Irish characters going, "God save the King." And so it's, you could imagine, it's nice that we had the nationalists and the unionists coming together, Protestants and Catholics, lovely jubbly, but this, ending on this "God save the King" thing, you could imagine how nationalists wouldn't have been too keen on a story like that. So they were trying to come up with alternatives. And so you had, around Christmas time in 1914, two young Dublin fellas. They were in their late teens. Percy Reynolds, who went on to a very notable career in business, became a very wealthy young man, and another fellow, Patsy O'Connor, who is notable for a different reason. He's the first name listed on the Fianna Roll of Honour of members who gave their lives for Irish freedom. And he was hit over the head during the 1913 lockout when he was administering first aid to one of the striking workers, and started to have headaches. And then eventually in 1915, he died. Now, this is the story the Fianna put forward. Glasnevin Cemetery, in his interment record, says that he died of pneumonia. But, who wants to get in the way of a good story there? But these two fellas, they created a publication for Christmas 1914 called Nollaig na Bhíon. And they got all sorts of stories. You've got James Connolly's in there. You've got Grace Gifford is doing illustrations. And basically what it was a one-off Christmas annual. And they got lots of nationalist organisations, or lots of nationalist businesses to buy advertising. And it was considered to be a real financial success. So the guys were thinking, woohoo! And as I said, Percy was going on to become a businessman. So the next year they started their own newspaper, Fianna. But they found it was really hard to compete against the British publications, and eventually it was a publication that didn't last. But it gives you an example there of a couple of young Dublin fellas who were trying to get out there and trying to really make something of themselves. But they recognised that these kind of papers were enormously popular with their fellow children. So all this worry and concern about children, all this investment of effort into moulding their minds and their bodies, this is all rooted in anxieties about national competitiveness. So by investing in children, Western countries wanted to invest in their own futures at a time when they were worried about what their place was going to be in the world in the future. So all this concern about children expressed through legislation, social policies, youth movements, all of this emerged in the years leading up to the First World War was to a certain extent a manifestation of the rivalries between Western countries that contributed to the outbreak of that conflict. So how did the First World War impact on children here in Dublin? And I'll just give you some examples. I'm going to start with food. And this was something that Irish farmers prospered during the war years. So you've got troops, you've got horses, which would have been the key form of military transport at the time. They need to be fed. So there's a strong demand for livestock, beef, butter, eggs, pork, wheat, as well as hay. So what benefited Irish farming and would have benefited the children growing up in those families put serious pressure on working class Dublin families. So by 1916, retail food prices were double what they had been before the war. And they did dietary studies in 1913 to 14, and they were saying that the typical labouring family with children couldn't afford to buy enough food to meet basic nutritional needs. So the breadwinner of the family, usually dad, he would have been given the largest share of the meat, then the kids, and then mum would have got the least nourishment of all. So what started off as an inadequate diet before the war ended up just getting worse over the course of the war. So even though wages increased, the quality and quantity of food that was available deteriorated. So meat, potatoes, sugar and milk all became scarcer over time and thus more expensive to buy. And so in March 1917, a probation officer, she was called Miss Gargan, she told the Irish Independent that basically starvation was widespread amongst the poorer classes in Ireland, she meant specifically here in Dublin. School dinners had to be stopped temporarily because the budget for school meals in Dublin had run out at the end of February, and the new rate to pay for them wasn't going to be struck until the end of March. So a very hungry time for the poorest here in Ireland. There was a doctor, she was working for the Women's National Health Association, and she had reported that almost all of the 59 children treated in February of 1917 suffered from malnutrition. So World War I, a really hungry time. And a lot of families, they were just surviving on dry bread and tea. So those war years left the poorest children in Ireland, particularly those living here in Dublin in the urban areas, hungrier than ever and more vulnerable to illness. Now, it may seem odd to think about this, but there were signs of hope even in these war years. And one of the more positive developments that have been put forward was that it heightened the awareness of Dublin's appalling infant and child mortality during those years. So Dublin had a notoriously high death rate in comparison to British cities. And the issue of maternal and child welfare attracted the attention of government officials as well as many voluntary agencies. So you had baby clubs being set up to raise awareness amongst mothers about the importance of hygiene and clean milk and other measures that they could take to prevent illness and disease and to save their babies' lives. And a large number of women's organisations convened a meeting at the Mansion House in the summer of 1916 to discuss this problem of infant and child mortality. And, I think it's really interesting that you've got organisations that were led by nationalists, but also women who were wives of leading government figures. They were coming together and attending this so soon after the Easter Rising because they saw this as a crisis issue that transcended political divisions in this country. So plans were in place by 1916 for a programme of health visitors that would provide advice and support to new mothers and to mothers of children up to the age of 5. And this concern about maternal and child welfare continued in the whole post-war, past, you're kind of getting into the Irish Revolution period with the foundation by Dr. Kathleen Lynn and others of St. Ultan's Hospital for Infants in 1919. And this would be very important for promoting the health of children in the coming years. And that I've kind of, was alluding there to the 1916 Rising. I mean, it brought the effects of combat, what was being seen on the European continent, here to the streets of Dublin. And of course, we've all heard, during 2016, with all the I think probably the most popular book that came out during that period was Joe Duffy's book on Children of the Rising, where he was excavating the lives of the 40 children under the age of 17 who died during the Rising. And the thing that we have to remember was that most of these children were innocent bystanders. I mean, the first child to be killed was killed because he was in the pushchair. His mother was pushing the pushchair. She had no idea a rising had broken out, and he was hit by the crossfire. So this was something we have to remember. This was a time when children were much more likely to be out on the streets. The first day of the Rising, when people had no idea this was happening. They were out and about. And then later, as the week went on, when food became more and more scarce, people were out trying to get food. Again, children were being killed in this search for food. So we've got most of them innocent bystanders, children in the wrong place at the wrong time, getting hit. We've got an example here. This girl, Margaret Veal, she was mistaken for a rebel. She was looking out of the window of her house, possibly using binoculars, and it was assumed that she was rebel, and she was shot. But on the other hand, you also had young people who were active during the Rising. So James Fox, who was aged 16, and Charles Darcy, who was aged 15, they were combatants. One was a member of Na Fianna Éireann, the other of the Irish Citizen Army. Another Fianna member, 15-year-old Sean Healey. Now, I know he doesn't look 15 in this picture. He was a bit younger there, but he had just turned 15 at that time, and he was shot by the British Army close to his Phibsborough home. And apparently Thomas McDonough had sent the boy home from Jacob's biscuit factory because he was too young to fight. But it appears he had given him a message to take with him to say that they were expecting an ambush at the bridge in Phibsborough. And this was when he was killed. So aside from all these children who lost their lives, many others would have lost parents, siblings. They might have lost their homes. So many houses were burnt out. So there were many ways in which children were affected by the Rising. But also, one of probably the most common experience of the Rising for young people was witnessing it. There you go. And this is, I think, really highlights one of the most common ways. So this young woman here, this is 17-year-old Jessica Taylor. And you can see she went on to become a VAD during the war years. And she recorded what she saw during the rebellion in her personal diary. And that was part of an exhibition in 2016 at Marsh's Library. So she lived in Malahide with her parents, who'd been born in England. The family owned a series of butcher's shops in the Dublin area. They were members of the Church of Ireland. And in the days leading up to the insurrection, her diary talks things like, going off to social visits over tea and darning socks and going to church. But once the Rising breaks out, all of her references to these sorts of everyday things are entwined with the sights and sounds of the rebellion and its impact on the lives of civilians. So on Easter Monday, April 24th, she's in the garden with her mum, and somebody comes and tells them there's a rebellion broken out in Dublin. So her and her father go down to the train station in Malahide, and they find out, yes, indeed, yes, there's a rising broken out. And she writes, the trains were all stopped running, and everyone was looking for beds all around the show. It's a show, it's a spectacle, it's something to go look at. And that was how a lot of Dubliners, they thought this was a public spectacle. And of course, because of this going to watch the show, many of them got killed. So her and her father, they take the train into town. They got nearly to the top of Talbot Street, but there was a barricade across the street, and they had to go back, and they had kind of find their way through. And they see a lot of shops. They're going down Sackville Street, as it was then. A lot of shops there were smashed, and there's Sinn Féiners in the GPO and Tommies in Trinity, she says. So they make their way to Bagot Street on foot, and they appear to have stayed with family for the rest of the week there. And just to give you another example, on Wednesday the 26th, Jessica recorded that she and her cousin Nora stationed themselves at the back windows of Haddington Road Chapel, so presumably St. Mary's Catholic Church, and they were watching the Sinn Féiners and the Tommies, as she called them, firing away like blazes on Northumberland Road during the Battle of Mount Street Bridge. So there they are, they're watching it. And her reference to the rebels as Sinn Féiners reflects that common misconception at the time that the insurrection was instigated by radical nationalists who supported Arthur Griffith's Sinn Féin party rather than the military council of the Irish Republican Brotherhood. So eyewitness accounts frequently referred to the rebels as Sinn Féiners rather than Irish volunteers or the Irish Citizen Army, which were, again, the main paramilitary organisations that were fighting during the rebellion. So her diary entries indicate that her sympathies were with the British soldiers who were trying to put down the rebellion. And that's not surprising, given her family background. So on Saturday the 29th, she reports that we have been talking to the Tommies, and they're awfully nice, especially a lance corporal of about 20. And this interest in this soldier, so typical of a teenage girl. But these years of the Great War and the Irish Revolution were also providing young people with opportunities to volunteer their services. And again, we've got Jessica here in her VAD uniform. We've also got 17-year-old Neville Shute Norway. He was the son of the secretary of the Irish Post Office, Arthur Hamilton Norway, and he volunteered as a stretcher bearer for the St. John's Ambulance Society during the Easter Rising. And he later went on to be quite a well-known novelist, Neville Shute. So when Neville headed back to boarding school in England after the Easter holidays, he wrote he felt so much more self-confident going out, and because he was watching the rebellion and going out and being a stretcher bearer. This was super exciting. So he felt more self-confident, but also he was astonished that when he went back to boarding school, people wanted to hear about what he'd seen, what he'd done, what he'd experienced, and they wanted to listen to him, even though he had a stammer. This was a big deal. So this is, I think, kind of, you have all these different ways of young people experiencing the Rising. And then, of course, we've got those who participated. We had the members of the Fianna who got involved. So there was a lot of efforts made to keep the younger Fianna boys out of the fight. They had a camp out in the Dublin Mountains for the Easter weekend. But many former and current members of the Fianna participated in the Rising, the older ones as commanders, some as fighters, younger ones as dispatch carriers and scouts. 7 were killed during the Rising. And of course, we know that 2 in their 20s who were executed for their role, Con Colbert and Sean Houston. And at least 3 members of the Clan na Gael Girl Scouts, the female equivalent of the Fianna, also participated in the Rising. So their founding member, May Kelly, she served at Jacob's Biscuit Factory. And another member, 15-year-old, now I know she's a bit older than 15 in this picture, Mary McLaughlin, she volunteered as a courier. So she was going all around Dublin delivering messages and ammunition. And political activism was in her family's blood. Her father was a coal carter and trade union activist, and her elder brother Sean, who'd belonged to the Fianna and the Irish Volunteers, distinguished himself during the Rising, and another brother, Paddy, also participated. Now, Mary's mother didn't appreciate her 15-year-old daughter running around Dublin in the middle of the Rising. And so Mary stopped off at home just to tell her mum, I'm fine, everything's fine. And her mum promptly locked her into her bedroom, and she was saying, well, my fine Rossie, and I'm glad to see you and have you home again, but I intend to keep you safe with me. So she locks her into the bedroom, but Mary happens to have picked up a gun that she'd found. So she climbs out the window and goes back to the GPO to give them the gun. But as these, and the other thing about poor old Mary, and again, an example, 15-year-olds at that time generally were out in the workforce, and Mary had been working for Arnott's department store, but because she'd been out in the Rising, she lost her job. But as these examples show, the Easter Rising could be everything from a personal tragedy to an opportunity for empowerment and entertainment for the youth of Dublin. Now, when Irish independence finally came in 1922, it did little to ease the woes of those very, very hungry children that we talked about during the First World War. So the poorest and youngest inhabitants of the city didn't really get much out of it, certainly in the beginning. There was a report published in 1927 by the Committee on the Relief of Unemployment, and it noticed that there were more people living in Dublin's slums there were more people living in Dublin's slums in 1927 than there were in 1913, the year of the lockout. So historian Lindsay Erner-Byrne has observed, significantly, for a society that valorised the large family and prohibited birth control unequivocally since 1935, the worst housed were the young families. And there was very much, science had proved it, there was a clear link between overcrowding and high infant mortality rates. Now, Lindsay's recent book, Letters of the Catholic Poor, illuminates the experiences of the poor as expressed in letters to the Catholic Archbishop of Dublin, Dr. Edward Byrne. And these people were writing to him asking for financial assistance. And letter after letter that she quotes, you've got these people, they basically are explaining to him how many young children they are trying to feed and clothe and house and how difficult this is. But I think we also have to remember that the poor weren't necessarily working class. There was an unusual case she raises of Marion G., who was a Fox Rock widow who was struggling to support her young family after the death of her husband, a solicitor. And Marion wrote at least 29 letters to the Archbishop between 1924 and 34 seeking assistance. And she also got her 12-year-old, her eldest daughter, to write the following letter in 1924 in support of her mother's request for help. And again, you can see it here. My dear Lord Archbishop, for the sake of my little sisters and brother, will you grant Mammy's last request? She will never call on you again until we pay you back. Will your grace please save our home for the last time? We shall never worry you again and always pray for you. I am, my dear Lord Archbishop, your obedient child, Helen G. And really, in the absence of a proper social welfare safety net, such begging letters were one strategy employed by Dublin's poor. But as the 20th century went on, rays of hope started to shine on all this doom and gloom as the state began to develop better social welfare programs. So, for instance, children's allowance payments, that legislation was passed in 1944. We also see improved educational opportunities. For example, of course you had the compulsory primary school education, but where things really start to change for young people is in the late 1960s with the introduction of free secondary school education. And it's with something like that you start to have better improved employment opportunities and ultimately more economic prosperity. And this helped to lengthen the period of childhood and adolescence here in Dublin. So the longer you stay in school, the more of a childhood and an adolescence you could have. So last summer, I was collecting some childhood memories of growing up in Dunleary in the 20th century for an exhibition that was part of an event day that was being organised by the proposed National Museum of Childhood. And the memories and images that were shared by some of our respondents, I've used those as you can see some of the images here from MJ and NJ who grew up in Dunleary, but other examples I'll be giving to you because they kind of illustrate these general trends in childhood in the latter half of the 20th century. So relations between parents and children were changing over the course of the 20th century. So we know from the 1960s onwards, the size of families was gradually decreasing. And furthermore, of course, we've got government policies that facilitated young people staying in school longer. And that meant that their productive role in the economy as full-time workers, that's going by the wayside. So instead of working full-time to help support their families, to give mums some money towards the rent, what we've got are teenagers who work part-time and, the bit of money they're making, that's not given to mum to help with the household expenses. That's to buy new clothes and records and to participate in youth culture. So the loss of children's contribution to the family economy forced parents to rethink the value that they placed on children. So parents began to value their children for emotional reasons only, not just economic and emotional reasons. And increasingly, children were seen as the focus of expenditure, with parents wanting to give their kids a better childhood than they had had themselves. And there was also more focus on the home as new housing estates were built in Dublin. And it meant that people could afford to live in less cramped conditions, making home a more attractive place to spend time. And furthermore, there were changes in how parents acted and how they were viewed, and particularly fathers. There were changes in relation to them. They became less remote and less authoritarian. And there seems to have been, it's been suggested that you start to have a generational change, a shift happening in the 1940s, with fathers becoming more involved in childcare. And that's, of course, something that just gathers pace over time. Also, the increased market for toys. That's a symbol of this change in parent-child relations. And the whole idea is toys bring joy, maybe not always, but this is associated with the cult of domesticity and a desire to occupy children at home. And so you start to see a children's consumer culture for the middle and upper classes first emerging in the 18th century. Since then, we've seen it trickle down to all classes and become big business. And I think the money spent on children's birthday parties today, like places like Jump Zone or various leisure complexes, I think is indicative of this increased prosperity and also parents' emotional investment in their children. I also wonder if there's an element of guilt going on, in terms of maybe with working parents, they're not able to host as many play dates, so they figure, well, we'll have a big birthday party for the class, and that'll cover me for the play dates because, my child's in the after-school program or something like that. So birthday parties weren't quite so elaborate 50 years ago, but they were still a noteworthy occasion. And I had a couple of my respondents, MJ, she grew up in the 60s and 70s, and she reported that our birthdays were celebrated with cake and candles, but we didn't have birthday parties as such. And then she said the first birthday party she was invited to was in the first year of secondary school, and she didn't know what to expect. She'd never been to one before, and it was an all-girl house party. The girl was 13, and there would be party games devised by the parents. But already there were rumours that this was a bit childish, and maybe some others were having boys over to their parties and things like that. And then her younger sister, NJ, recalled that I only had once a party in my house with friends invited. It was my 10th birthday, and my mother made me a black velvet dress. I got a bike for my birthday, a big treat. About 8 girls were invited to our house, and my sister and mother had lots of games set up for us to play. We had sandwiches and cake and diluted soft drinks. But birthday parties aren't the only sign of the times. Santa Claus, I know it's the wrong time of the year for him, we've just had the Easter Bunny, but he's also symbolic of the change in relations between parents and children. And the Jolly Fat Man apparently began to visit many, but not all, Irish children as early as the 1920s. And the theory about Santa Claus, not just here in Ireland, but in other places, was that he was able to exert a greater disciplinary influence than fathers because children didn't want to be on the naughty list. Scared. So this allowed fathers to relax and not have to be such a disciplinarian. And this enabled more emotional bonding between the father and the children. So since that initial appearance of Santa Claus, of course, we've seen the massive commercialisation of children's leisure, particularly since the 1960s. And earlier this week, I was giving a talk to a group of over 50s as part of DCU's lifelong learning programme. And I was asking them how they thought childhood has changed over time, particularly, say, in the last 50 years or so. And one thing they said was that they felt children have less freedom now. Because parents were so worried about stranger danger and Dublin traffic that we don't let our kids play out in the street anymore or let them walk to school alone. So this freedom to roam and organise your own social life, not having mummy organise the play dates, this was something that one of my respondents highlighted about his suburban childhood. So Michael grew up in Dalkey in the 1970s and 80s, and he recalled that it was a time, as far as I remember, where children had total freedom, certainly more freedom than they have now, and could play in the streets, on green areas nearby, in each other's houses and gardens, and generally anywhere. As we got older, teenagers, we began to explore areas from the lead mines under White Rock, deserted houses in Dalkey, the tunnel at Our Lady's Well, and anywhere deserted or abandoned from Dalkey to Dunleary via Glenageary and Glasstool. So I guess, have we disempowered children by taking away those freedoms? And I guess that brings me to this a theme that comes up by the end of the 20th century. And as that century continued to go on and to roll into the 21st century, there's been increasing concerns that childhood, modern childhood as a time of innocence, is being eroded. So children, they're wearing the same styles as adults. They're being presented with images of sex and violence in the visual media, and of course now we're all worried about the internet. There's a perceived collapse of adult authority over children, and a shift in the balance of power between parents and children, that often parents are looking for emotional gratification from their children. Think about all the snapshots, or, well now, with our phones, all the pictures that we're taking of them. Also, children began to gain more rights in the late 20th century, and that brought them closer in equality to adults. So the 1989 United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child provides for the protection of the child as well as for his or her right to be heard in any decision that affects their life. And of course, that is very much the case today. And furthermore, we've got a much greater concern about children's safety, and this has led to greater protection for children, and again, getting rid of some of those freedoms. So particularly since the 1980s, we've become much more aware of child abuse, whether it's at home or in institutional care or in other settings. And we're also more aware of the danger to children from other children, the impact of bullying, for example. So to conclude, between 1900 and the year 2000, children in Dublin saw adults take action to address increasing concerns about their health, their education, and their moral welfare. They felt the impact of the First World War here on the home front, and they witnessed the revolutionary events that led to Irish independence. They experienced poverty as well as growing prosperity. And along the way, children gained rights, but they also lost freedoms. So childhood in the 20th century, whether here in Dublin or elsewhere in the Western world, it's a bit of a conundrum. And it seems in so many ways, childhood is getting better for a wider variety of children. That seemed to be the trend. And yet, at the same time, it feels like childhood is getting worse in other ways. So that's kind of my bit. I've done my bit here. I want to know now, what do you think?